Welcome to episode 191 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Q. John Tamm, who served in the FBI for nearly 30 years. He spent most of his career in the Philadelphia division, working complex organized crime, labor racketeering, political corruption, civil rights, street gangs, and illegal drug investigations. In this episode, John Tamm reviews his investigation of Teamster union official Frank Sheeran for labor racketeering, and reviews the movie The Irishman, directed by Martin Scorsese and starring Robert DeNiro as Frank Sheeran. John Tamm addresses Sheeran's claims of killing Jimmy Hoffa and being a hitman for the mob. Later in his bureau career, Tamm served for a short period in the Atlantic City Resident Agency out of the Newark Division and spent several years as a supervisory special agent on the Justice Task Force conducting informant management evaluations and criminal employee misconduct investigations relating to the John Connolly and Whitey Bulger case in the Boston Division. Tamm's last assignment before retiring was serving as an FBI liaison and member of the professional staff for the 9/11 Commission. After retirement, he worked for the government contractor Booz Allen Hamilton as a law enforcement and intelligence consultant. Currently, John Tamm is employed as a principal administrative officer of the Presbytery of Eastern Virginia. Now, before we get to the interview, I have some exciting news. FBI Retired Case File Review will be on Podcast Row at CrimeCon 2020 in Orlando, May 1st through May 3rd. Now, if you don't know what CrimeCon is, well, it is the largest true crime convention in the world. If you are planning to attend, I cannot wait to meet you in person. Please use the promo code FBI 2020 for 10% off your registration. If you want more information, there is a link for CrimeCon in your podcast app's description of this episode and on the homepage of my website, jerrywilliams.com. A few more quick things. For those of you who listened to my entire bonus episode with the audiobook samples, all I have to say to you is, if you thought it was too late, it is not. Sorry for the cryptic message, but some of you will know what I mean. Also, thank you for those who emailed me about my Reader Team post about my visit back to the FBI Academy. If you never got that email, check your spam filter. There were lots of photos, so your email provider may have rejected it, which is so frustrating. Let me know if you missed it, and maybe I'll resend it. I also want to take the time to invite those of you who are not yet a member of my Reader Team to join my Reader Team. Once a month, I send out my email digest and try to keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. There's a link to join my Reader Team in your podcast app's description of this episode. The audiobook, ebook, paperback, and hardback for FBI Myths and Misconceptions are available wherever books are sold. You can find an easy link to some of the retailers in your podcast app. If you've already picked up a copy of FBI Myths and Misconceptions, thank you. Please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, John Tamm. Hey, John, how are you doing?
Hi, Jerry. I'm doing fine, thank you.
We worked in the Philadelphia division together. We're going to have a chance to go through your career at the end of the interview. That's where I'll ask you when and why you joined the FBI. And I know you've got a fantastic story to tell because you're a legacy, a legacy employee. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you about Frank Sheeran.
Yes, I, along with other agents, investigated him in the late 1970s, starting in 1978, September of 1978.
Yeah, so he's in the news right now. He's been in the news for several years. First, when the book came out, I heard You Paint Houses. And now that the movie came out, The Irishman, I mean, he's really, really big. And so most people associate Frank Sheeran with the union, with the Teamsters union, but definitely with the Jimmy Hoffa case. He's associated with that. But I thought because you are the person who investigated Frank Sheeran right after Hoffa went missing, that you really are the person who can tell us, exactly who he was, especially when it comes to the mob. So I'm going to let you set the stage and talk about where in the FBI you were and what you were assigned to investigate.
Well, I was on the labor racketeering squad, which at that time in the Philadelphia division was OC2. And when the case started, an informant by the name of Charles Allen had been developed by an agent by the name of Henry Handy and William McMullen. They worked together. And my recollection was they were on Squad 4, that they worked on principally organized crime cases related to interstate transportation of stolen property and theft from interstate transportation. So Handy had developed Allen as an informant a couple of years before he became a cooperating witness. And the distinction is, which would be known to most FBI agents, is that he was a confidential informant and was not expected to testify, and his identity wouldn't be revealed. But when he became a cooperating witness in 1978, he would covertly record conversations and assist us in other phases of a covert investigation. And in this case, it was of Frank Sheeran and another labor leader by the name of Ralph Natale, who later became, for a short while, the boss of the Philadelphia family.
Yeah, when it comes to making the association with the Teamsters Union and organized crime, there's really no denying it when you have a union leader become the head of a mob family.
Well, in this case, Ralph Natale was the head of a bartenders union in Camden, Hotel and Restaurant Employees Local 170. Sheeran was the president of Teamsters Local 326 in Wilmington, Delaware. And this was a local that had been spun off from Teamsters Local 107, which is located on Spring Garden Street in Philadelphia, and which had been the principal Teamsters local up until the late 1960s, early 1970s, when Jimmy Hoffa, still as the president of the Teamsters, established some new locals, giving one to Sheeran. And Sheeran, although he was the president, was rarely at the union. The union hall, back when we were investigating Sheeran, was in Wilmington, right by the Amtrak station. So if we wanted to conduct a surveillance, or the Baltimore division wanted to conduct a surveillance because it was in their territory, all you had to do is basically stand in the train station. You were looking right at the front door, and Sheeran had a big green Lincoln Town car that he parked there. However, most of the time, Sheeran was doing the bidding of the mafia boss from Northeast Pennsylvania, Russell Buffalino. And they had the close association, and it was that association in 1975 that came to the attention of the FBI at the time of the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa lived outside Detroit, Michigan, and he'd started in the Teamsters as the president of a Teamsters local in Detroit. Russell Buffalino and Frank Sheeran were attending a wedding of Buffalino's nephew, William Buffalino. So that it was the daughter of William Buffalino. So it had been Buffalino's niece in the Detroit area. And that wedding was on the Saturday of that weekend. So Hoffa ostensibly disappeared on July 30th, which I believe was a Saturday, and had gone to a meeting, or what he thought would be a meeting, in a suburban restaurant. I don't remember clearly the name of the restaurant. I think was named Red Fox or something like that. He went to that meeting and he never returned. So he disappeared from that meeting. And there were a number of mobsters in the area. So Detroit Division opened a case that they codenamed Hoffex to try to find out what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. And another case was opened, and I'm not so sure this wasn't, it didn't have as its office of origin the Newark Division, called Probex. And both of them were looking at the disappearance of Hoffa and the larger problem of criminality in the Teamsters Union. Now, Hoffa was not the president at the time. He had recently been paroled from a prison sentence. He was in Lewisburg in the Philadelphia Division territory. And he was serving a sentence there for jury tampering, I think perjury, and obstruction of justice. So he had recently been released. And while he was at Lewisburg, he met and made friends with and used Charles Allen, who was doing a sentence there for bank robbery. Allen was paroled, came back to the Philadelphia area. He's originally from South Philadelphia. And my recollection is that he was the illegitimate son of Blinky Palermo. I think that was the story with him, but he just used the name Charles Harrison Allen. Allen was his mother's surname. And he was a street criminal and engaged in theft and other criminality, at least at that time. That's what he was being investigated for. And he was contacted by Henry Handy sometime in 1976, and Handy was able to skillfully convert him to an informant and start using him as an informant.
Why was he willing to cooperate? Because I believe at that time there were very few people that were associated with organized crime, with the mob, that were cooperating. So how did Handy, how was he able to get Allen to cooperate?
Well, he probably, this would be speculation on my part. I know why Allen became a cooperating witness, but why he became an informant, I would have to assume that Handy had developed some criminal activity on Allen's part that would have violated his parole. Because back at that time, you had the old parole system where most of these criminals were getting out of prison after only doing about 50% of their sentence, if that much. Allen later became a cooperating witness in September of 78 because he was implicated in a narcotics transaction or illegal drug transaction. It might have been methamphetamine. It might have been cocaine. So when I say narcotics, it was an illegal drug. So now he was significantly jammed up. Not only would his parole be violated and he'd be locked up right away, he was also going to have to, he would be successfully convicted of the other charges. Handy then pitched him for being a cooperating witness, and Allen agreed to do it. And Allen at the time was living down in Washington Township, Gloucester County.
That's where I live, a neighbor.
Right. At that time, that area was part of the Newark Division. It's now been part of the Philadelphia Division for quite a few years. But anyway, we had an agreement with Newark, and we started to operate them and deal with them both in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And one of the first people he talked about certainly was Ralph Natale. Natale was, as I say, the general secretary, I think, or general secretary treasurer, that was the term, of Bartenders Local 170, but also at least at that time, a half-ass mob guy. And he was talking with Handy about him, and Natale, right about that time, was indicted for an arson mail fraud scheme he had. They burned down a furniture store out in Marlton called Mr. Living Room to collect the insurance proceeds. The owner was heavily in debt to Natale for gambling debts. And that was one of the first things that came up. But then it turned out that Allen had access to Sheeran, had been with Sheeran before, and had actually engaged in criminality for Sheeran as early as 1975. And the first thing that Allen actually brought up was a murder that he claimed that he had done for Sheeran of an independent union official by the name of Francis J. Marino. And Marino went by the nickname of Big Bobby, so Big Bobby Marino. And he had an office on Market Street, not far from the Philadelphia headquarters in the 200 block of Market Street. And Allen went in there one day with a silenced 22 Woodsman semi-automatic pistol, a 22 long pistol, and killed Marino. And that was one of the first things he told us about. And so I was now working on the case along with Handy, Bill McMullen, Robert Brown, and Jim Marr. All of us were working together as a team on this case. And the case agent on Natalie's arson case was Dave Seal, but we could not have any contact with Seal about what the work we were doing with Allen because of a potential, what they used to call Chinese wall issue, where the information about Natalie's defense of his criminal charges might come to Allen, and Allen then tell us, and we would tell Seal, and so that never happened. But Seal has had his own case on Natalie. So the first thing was this Marino murder. And I went to the medical examiner and got the reports, and went to homicide over at the Roundhouse and got the reports. And basically what Allen had told us was consistent with the forensic evidence from the crime scene. The homicide division didn't have a suspect or anything. Then Allen related that he had attempted to murder a couple of other people on Sheeran's behalf. One was a union official and a union other than the Teamsters, but they were called the mail handlers. And they actually were the people who drove the delivery trucks for newspapers in New York. And they were an independent union, single local, not part of a national union. And that the guy he was supposed to kill lived out on Long Island. And then he was supposed to have attempted to kill a Teamsters union official in Teamsters Local 500, which is in Philadelphia. It was the meat truck drivers. I don't recall, but I think there might have been one other person. So we had him wired up. So he was, Allen met with Sheeran frequently, often sitting in Sheeran's motor vehicle while they went to North Jersey, or they went to up to Wilkes-Barre area of Pennsylvania, and they would talk about other crimes that Sheeran wanted committed, talk about the murders not the murders. Sheeran pretty scrupulously avoided talking about the murders. But Sheeran did talk about a scheme that he had going with a guy by the name of Eugene Hoffa. And Hoffa was a businessman from Clifton Heights, New Jersey. No, Clifton, New Jersey. Forget which one. One's in Jersey and one's in Pennsylvania. But anyway, Clifton, New Jersey was up in Union County. And it was a labor leasing scheme, which the Department of Labor, with their organized crime unit at the time, they subsequently renamed themselves the Inspector General of the Labor Department. Their special agents had a case open on Hoffa and a number of his business associates, as well as Sheeran, but it didn't involve a covert investigation with recorded conversations. But anyway, they would talk about this investigation. And Sheeran also would talk about his relationship with Buffalino. And he referred to Buffalino through his wife's name. So Sheeran, who really stuttered terribly. I had to transcribe a lot of tapes. Very, very hard to hear him say anything clearly. But he used to refer to Buffalino by his wife's name, which was Carrie, Carrie. But during this period of time, what they didn't talk about was any murder, and they didn't talk about any murder of Hoffa, and they didn't talk about the murder of Big Bobby Marino. So we accumulated other evidence about the arson of the Charlie Allen had done of a union hall in Philadelphia on Sheeran's behalf. Two unions were merging into a single union, and the thought was by one of the union officials that if he had the other union's union hall burned down, they would dominate because they would have to move to their building. And both of these were small unions, row houses. I remember up in kind of the Port Richmond neighborhood. And one was burned down, and the forensic evidence, ATF had conducted an investigation along with Philadelphia Fire Marshal, and it was consistent with what Alan told us. And he was kind of, Alan was not real bright, and this was a good example of how he screwed up. He broke in, poured a lot of gasoline in the place, decided he was going to have a little fuse line of gasoline out the back of the building where he would light a cigarette, and then throw it down into the gasoline, and it would go inside and blow the place up. But he lit the cigarette too early. The fumes were ignited. He was blown out into the lot. But he, got himself up and got out of there. Of course, there were some witnesses, but they, couldn't identify him. And the building burned down. It was clearly arson. And then a couple of other things that Sheeran ultimately got charged with was embezzlement from the union for paying Allen at a minimum. And then some other schemes he cooked up to get even with people he didn't like. He wanted a guy beaten up down in Wilmington, Delaware, who was a management official for a company called Hiab Cranes and Loaders. And we actually staged that one. There was an agent on the labor squad at the time by the name of Kay Anderson, who was a registered nurse. So we approached the intended victim. I don't recall his name right off the top of my head. I think it was like Immelman or something like that. And put a soft cast on his left forearm. And he told everybody he'd been hit by a bat. Somebody stepped out of the shadows in a parking lot in Wilmington and whacked him with this bat. And got back to Sheeran. Alan said he'd done the job. Here's a guy who's wounded back at work, where the Teamster union members would see him. And he was not the chief executive officer. He was like the chief operating officer. And he even told the chief executive officer of this business that he'd been attacked. And of course, that guy then sent a telegram. I mean, this is not, we're really dating ourselves, but it was the 70s, to Teamster's headquarters in Washington, to Frank Fitzsimmons, who was then the general president of the Teamsters. He was Hoffa's successor, complaining about this attack and blaming it on Sheeran. So we got kind of the results we wanted. And Sheeran, of course, talked about that a lot. He was very pleased it worked out that way. And he wanted Charlie Allen then to burn down the business, which, of course, it would have been hard for us to stage that, and it never happened.
Now, I wanted to just to make sure everybody's clear on the time. So Hoffa went missing in 1975, and all of this is occurring, in 1978, 1979?
Right. I mean, Allen was actively worked as a CW between early September 1978 until February of 1979. So there wasn't particularly, we're talking 5 months. But during that 5 months, really Allen was never detected. We had one technical failure that I belatedly, we were suspicious of, but it wasn't one of these things where we were going to raise an issue about it. And Allen was supposed to, at one of his final conversations, talk with Sheeran about the murder of Francis Marino, Big Bobby Marino. And what happened was we had given Allen a subpoena, if I remember correctly, to make it sound like we were investigating it federally. He ostensibly was interviewed by some FBI agents who asked him about Marino. And Allen, of course, refused to talk, and now he was going to consult with Sheeran about this. And the assumption was Sheeran was going to tell him what to do. Well, that conversation didn't fly. And what happened was, if you recall, the old Nagras had a spring-loaded switch that you would put in, and the machine would start running, and you'd have tapes of various amounts of time. And we were always using the reels that had the maximum recording time on them, around 3 hours. And then Henry Handy, most often, he was also a technical agent. He would tape down that switch so that it would be really impossible to pop up. But for some reason, something loosened the tape and the switch popped up. And I don't know if Allen got cold feet or what, but came back and we didn't have anything on the tape, and it was very disappointing. So
And would you say that this was one of your most important recordings?
Yes, it would have been the most important recording because it was about this murder. And the murder we had all sorts of evidence about, and Alan was going to be given a break on what was a first-degree murder, a murder for hire. And we wanted to, have it tight. Anyway, we sent him back. One of the things, when I talked about high ebb cranes and loaders, which was down in Delaware, one of the things Alan had told Sheeran was that he was going to make a time bomb and place it at high ebb cranes and loaders and have it blow up and, destroy at least the office of the business, which was in the Wilmington area. It was in Newcastle County. I'm not sure if it was in the mailing area of Wilmington. So the next conversation, we sent Alan back, and this time, the recorder worked, but Sheeran was very cautious in talking about that murder. And so, I think that's relevant to this movie about him because he could have taken credit for that murder also. Francis J. Marino, if he was shooting everybody else. And the question would have been asked, well, why didn't you shoot Marino? Why'd you have Charlie Allen go do it? But anyway, they went back and they had a conversation, and I'm having to recall this from 40 plus years ago. But they have a conversation, and Sheeran suggests to him, well, you know what? There was one other union official involved in this, Louis Batone, who was the head of Teamsters Local 107. And Charlie had a couple of conversations with Batone that were recorded, but they really didn't get anywhere. And Batone was allegedly in on this murder of Marino also, because Marino was a threat to the Teamster locals if he were to organize a business where Teamsters had members and kind of steal their members. So that was the motive behind the whole thing. But I don't think this guy would have ever gotten anywhere, but that's beside the point. They weren't going to take a chance. Anyway, those conversations were all very ambivalent and, no smoking gun. While the scheme with Eugene Hoffa was clearly laid out by Sheeran, some with code language, and he actually also clearly laid out the high ebb cranes and loaders case and the assault on this guy down in Delaware. So he was very specific about that, had very good taped recorded evidence on that.
Well, of course, the FBI and the Labor Department, they all knew who Sheeran was and the things that he was capable of. But it seemed like it was pretty public knowledge also, because I have this article from February 1979 from the Inquirer, and the title is Mafia Hitman List Who's Who in Crime. And when it comes to Frank Sheeran, they say that he works for the Buffalino organized crime family, and that he is a major suspect in the Hoffa case, allegedly has ordered or participated in several murders, arsons, bombings, and assaults over the years. So when people talk about him possibly being the person responsible for Hoffa missing, I can see why some people are giving that credit. He was a pretty, criminal guy.
Yes, and and it was in Buffalino's criminal interest to have Hoffa removed. So, inasmuch as Sheeran could assist in Hoffa's murder, it's a possibility. But I, as somebody who investigated him and was actively engaged in 3 trials with him, 2 of which we got convictions, 1 which he was acquitted, I do not think he shot Hoffa. I don't think there's any way that Frank Sheeran, got Hoffa to go into a house with him somewhere in Detroit or a suburb of Detroit and shot him.
Well,
there's a lot of preposterous stuff in this I Hear You Paint Houses book by Charles
Brandt, I think.
Brandt, yeah.
I know I brought it up, but why don't we continue on the chronological path, and we'll talk about that at the end. I just kind of wanted to give a little color to the fact that all of this is going on, and it's basically known that you have this, union official that is all tied in. So talk about that very first trial, because now you have your informant, Charles Allen, providing all of this great information and these tapes. And so I'm sure you were very confident that, in this first trial, that Sheeran was going down.
We were very confident. We were going to be playing at least 30 conversations. Back then, you used to fight over the transcripts a lot, but we were getting the transcripts in. The old rule was they couldn't listen to a tape or read a transcript unless they had the tape in front of them. They had to close the transcripts, the notebook that they had had a loose binder notebook. They had the transcripts in. Got a little easier as time went on, but anyway, we had pretty high quality tapes, in my opinion. The Nagra was a very good recording device. We downloaded them onto Revoxes, if you remember them. They are the high quality reel-to-reel tape recorders that we would use most commonly on Title IIIs.
The real big ones.
Yeah, the big ones. They're super heavy. They were like trying to lift a washing machine or something, or front end loader. We had good quality for the most part. I think the transcripts were pretty much unassailable. We put the case in. Sheeran put on a couple of witnesses. He was represented by the former district attorney, F.M. Fitzpatrick Sr. I think he has a son named Junior, who's still a lawyer in Philadelphia. Fitzpatrick, just a little background on him, had been the district attorney, had been beat by Ed Rendell. Rendell, of course, is a national figure who had been head of the Democratic Party, later was also the mayor of Philadelphia, and I think he was the governor of Pennsylvania too.
Yep,
right?
yep.
And anyway, so he defeated Fitzpatrick in the Democratic primary, which in Philadelphia means you win. The general election's just a formality until Castile beats somebody. But anyway, so we thought we had a very good case, and it was tried by the strike force. Good attorneys. It was Bob Courtney and Pam Higgins. Put the case in, got all our witnesses in, played the tapes. And the jury was sequestered, and we certainly had a concern that they might try to fix the jury, because that certainly was the modus operandi of Hoffa when he was tried. But anyway, the defense was rather slim. Put on a couple of guys from Sheeran's local who contradicted some tapes with them on them that, well, this didn't happen. We weren't really there. That's not us. This sort of stuff. And we thought, well, that's all the better for us. If this is their evidence, and then they're clearly lying, that'll help us. And then Fitzpatrick called Sheeran, and Sheeran took the stand. And it's very unusual for a defendant, especially when you're going to have 30 tapes to play, to testify. But not to criticize anybody, but the cross-examination didn't go well. But first, Fitzpatrick asked a series of leading questions, which should have been objected to, where Sheeran, rather than having to explain or talk about what happened or deny it he just answered yes or no. And most of the time it was, did you have Charlie Allen kill Big Bobby Marino? No. Did you have Charlie Allen blow up Teamsters Local 513? No. Did you have Charlie Allen beat this guy Immelman? No. Et cetera. No. You're witness. And I don't think the two strike force attorneys anticipated that, and they had significant success later on in their career after this case. But anyway, they didn't cross-examine him real well, or the lead attorney didn't cross-examine Sheeran very well. And so the case went to the jury, and the closing arguments, later on, you can comment on the evidence, and sometimes that allows you to play the tapes again. And they didn't do that. So our strongest evidence had one hearing. And of course, Charlie Allen he was an adequate witness. He wasn't a super witness, but Fitzpatrick kind of played with him a little bit and got him angry. And I don't know if people were looking at Allen, he'd done all these really seriously bad crimes, murder, bank robbery, beating people. He had taken credit for when he was a kid on the South Street Bridge, as they saw a black guy, they'd try to throw him over the side. into the Schuylkill River. They found out that Allen had put cats into dryers and laundromats, and turned them on. And, that was, that sort of stuff. And it was mostly when he was a juvenile. But Charlie Allen was not normal. Believe me, he wasn't normal. But you know what? That you got to deal with people like that if you want to. Frank Sheeran was a full-time criminal also. And that's the way you catch him, with another full-time criminal. So anyway, that was all part of the cross-examination. There would occasionally be objections. Allen would be flustered. It was an effective cross by F. Emmett Fitzpatrick. So anyway, have the final arguments, final instructions from the judge, and trying to remember who the judge was, but I believe it was Judge Van Arsdale, who was considered they're all fair, don't get me wrong, but he was a down the road guy. So if you put your case on, you weren't going to have a problem with him. He wasn't somebody who suppressed a lot of evidence. So anyway, jury instructions, jury goes out. We go back over to the office. I'm sitting in the office. We're there about 2 hours. The phone rings on my desk, and it's Pam Higgins, who tells me that they've announced that they have a verdict. And I was, I had just tried maybe a year earlier. You don't have a lot of trials, as you know, in the FBI. Maybe one, if you work at organized crime, even organized crime, you probably only have 1/3 of your subjects go to trial, if that many.
Yeah, most plea.
Right. So anyway, I had just come off a trial, and it was like a 2-count indictment, and it was pretty clear cut, and it didn't have any electronic surveillance. But I was kind of surprised, because even in that case, the jury was out more than 2 hours. So we go back over to the courthouse and go up to the courtroom, and they come back in and they acquit him of everything. And my recollection was there wasn't a big number of counts. We had him charged with a RICO conspiracy and RICO predicate and ITAR, a couple of ITAR charges over the arsons, and union embezzlement. And the union embezzlement was like a slam dunk. I mean, he admitted that on the tape. And he had told Charlie to be, he was going to pay him out of the union funds, but not to tell anybody. And, he would have trouble justifying. I mean, it was like, that was clear cut, but they acquitted him of everything. And,
wow.
It was just flabbergasting.
Well, I know that you are known to be a very, I don't know what the word is, colorful, volatile, kind of a guy, knowing you from the office. So I take it you didn't take that very well.
Well, no, I didn't, but I didn't stand up and yell at the jury or anything, or I tried to really low-key it with the assistants, because they probably felt a lot worse than me, and Jim Marr and Henry Handy and Bill McMullen and Robert Brown, who had all worked on this case. I mean, everybody felt bad. The supervisor at the time was Frank Story, who later went on to be an assistant director. I think he was the assistant director in New York. Maybe, I forget. But he went further up in the bureau chain of command. And matter of fact, I think he had his retirement party the night that Paul Castellano was killed in New York. So that's kind of an interesting fact. But anyway, we were all shocked. And we went back and we weren't sure what was up. And then maybe a week or so goes by, and I get contacted by Ron Cole, who was also an assistant or strike force attorney, I guess is a better departmental attorney. A departmental trial attorney was their title back then. And he was working on a grand jury case with the Labor Department on a lot of things about the Boffa case, the Eugene Boffa scheme. And maybe we waited till the end of the year, because I think this verdict came in, I want to say in November of 1979 on this case. And Sheeran wasn't indicted a second time until July of 1980. A lot of things happened in the Philadelphia mob in that period of time.
Initially, you were on the organized crime squad, but I know that at some point a squad was broken off of that just concentrated on labor. When did that happen?
Well, no, I was always on the labor squad.
Oh, okay.
When Neil Welsh reorganized the office in December of 75, Organized Crime Squad 1 was the LCN squad. Organized Crime 2 was the labor squad. Organized Crime 3 was the squad for African Americans. So that would be like the Black Mafia, Junior Black Mafia, those guys. So that was Jim Sweeney and Jesse Colton and all those agents who worked those cases so successfully over the years. And Squad 4 was a squad that handled basically white guys who weren't in the mafia or in labor unions. And that was supervised by George Sherwood. And that's where Handy and Mullen were. I'm trying to think. Now I'm trying to think. And then there was a political corruption squad and a white collar crime squad. And I forget if we were 2 or 5. The labor squad was Squad 5 or Squad 2.
Actually, according to the Philadelphia Inquirer, I have an article here. It was Squad 4 because it says here, win or lose, FBI Squad 4 keeps regions unions on its toes. So it was Squad 4.
Okay. Well, Welsh was a real innovator, and he brought in people from Detroit, agents he thought would be good on organized crime, and he was right. And he also formed the surveillance squad, and it had a number, so I don't remember. And it was an OC squad. Before that, surveillance were organized on the fly. And so having kind of a special ops squad or whatever you want to call it really improved things. And the technical guys, that used to be catch as catch can also. I mean, people who were technical agents also worked cases. But then he dedicated, a number of technical agents or sound agents, as they were called at the time, to specifically doing that work and being on the surveillance squad, which he moved off site. That was another thing he did. So they were now out of the office. So he made the office much more efficient, and he got us away from having a whole bunch of people investigating communists out at the University of Pennsylvania, wasting agents on that sort of stuff. Really, he had a single counterintelligence squad, and that was that. There were no more security squads where they were investigating the Black Panthers or the Moore Science Church or whatever,
Yeah, that was all that stuff that got us into trouble, that COINTELPRO.
And they had agents who worked that. That was kind of silly, but that was what happened. But anyway, that was how we were organized. But for this case, we had Marr, who was from Squad 1, and Handy and McMullen, who were the property crime squad, whatever squad that was. And then Bob Brown was on the labor squad with me, and we were the kind of the core agents there. And so what happened then, and I don't think it's fair to say I was volatile, but when I saw an opportunity from Strike Force to use the very good evidence we still had about the Boffa case, I got back, I got into it. Now, I was not enamored of the Labor Department investigators, only because I thought that was really our violation, and that when it involved organized crime, and I thought that they really were there for more of a regulatory function, but probably wasn't fair to them, and so in retrospect, I should have been more collegial.
I guess the best word to describe you might have been outspoken. How's that?
Well, yeah, as long as I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings, I wasn't that outspoken. But I was outspoken about the fact that we weren't going to give up on Sheeran. I mean, that was true. And I was going to make an accommodation, not an accommodation, but I was going to work with the Labor Department. And so I started working with 2 labor agents. Their title was special agent, and they had been IRS agents. So they were 1811s, a guy named Robert McKee and a guy named Mel Goodconnect. And Goodconnect has actually written a book about this case, which is somewhat inaccurate. But I'll say at the time, he did a good job, and I don't have any problem with him personally. He mentions me kind of in less than flattering terms, but that's okay. I've never had any problem with after the fact or before the fact with McKee. And they had pulled together a good case, and they were working with Ron Cole. So that summer, the summer of 80, so this would have been after Bruno was shot and killed in March of 1980. In the summer of 1980, they indict Sheeran for the Eugene Hoffa case, along with Hoffa and a number of other defendants, most of them from North Jersey. They had been working in northern New Jersey, so the defendants in that case were Eugene Hoffa Sr., a guy named Robert Hoffa's son, Louis Calamar, Chandler Lemon, David Mishler, and Robert Risto. Well, bad news for everybody there but Robert Risto, because Robert Risto was a 137 of mine. He was an informant of mine that I had developed in the time between the end of the, basically the end of the covert part of the Sheeran case in February of 79 until this time in July of 1980.
And could you tell us how you did that? Because I think it's fascinating to hear about, somebody on the criminal side becoming a cooperator, an informant. And so, how did you do that?
Basically, Risto was motivated by vengeance. I had gotten his name from another informant who was familiar with the goings-on at Teamster's Local 107. Risto lived up in Port Richmond, so he wasn't a South Philadelphia hooked up or, wannabe LCN member, but more of a standalone guy. He came from a family of criminals. All his brothers had been locked up at one time or the other, and including Bobby Risto himself, Robert Risto. He went by Bobby Risto. He was very intelligent, had much more self-discipline than Charlie Allen, but he also was not going to be a flat-out cooperating witness. So I went to see him at his home, and it sounds kind of silly, but I took a six-pack of beer with me, and we sat down at his kitchen table, and he drank 5 and I drank 1, which is kind of what you want to have happen. And he started talking about this case. And Risto was also peripherally involved with methamphetamine production. And he was also had a numbers operation going. He had a couple of little side things that supported him. But he had worked for Eugene Hoffa as a strong-arm guy. So the basic Hoffa scheme was this. If you were a company that had truck drivers and you were having a problem with the local Teamsters union, it was kind of a two-step process. Eugene Hoffa would come to the owner and he would say, look, I'll hire your drivers. They'll work for my company, which was called Allstate Leasing, and I'll lease them back to you and I'll deal with the union. So you won't have any more problems. If you have a problematic worker that you wanted to get rid of and the union keeps you from doing it, now I'll deal with them and I'll get rid of them. And so basically that was the scheme. And what happened is then Hoffa, using Sheeran's entree, Frank Sheeran's entree, they would go to the local unions and pay off the union people or intimidate them or get them to look the other way, because these guys the drivers would still remain members of the local. Let's take local 326 in Wilmington. That's a good example. And they represented people outside of Delaware, in South Jersey, places like that. And then Hoffa knew Sheeran wasn't going to file a grievance on him or give him any sort of problem. And so then the obvious advantage to the business owner was, for about the same price, maybe a little bit more, he never had any more labor problems. And he didn't have to expose himself to, the potential of either having a union shut him down or being investigated by the Labor Department or the FBI for bribing a union official. So that's how that scheme worked. The things that they used to pay people off is that another business that Hoffa had was a automobile leasing business. And so Sheeran was in an automobile leased from Hoffa's businesses, and he had a different name, a company name for that, and I don't recall it. So Sheeran was in this vehicle, and he wasn't paying any lease charges. He didn't pay any down payment. He didn't pay anything. Matter of fact, Hoffa even paid for the car insurance. So it was just a giveaway, his big green Lincoln Town car. The scheme was rather simple, but it wasn't simple enough for Charlie Allen to understand. So Sheeran had to explain it to him. And those tapes were dynamite for evidence on this case. And then with Bobby Rispo from the other side. Bobby would be the guy who would go to the company, go out on the loading dock, call the drivers together and tell them they no longer worked for ABC Company. Now they worked for Allstate Leasing. And he would have these employment contracts, and they would have an opportunity to either sign and start working for Allstate, or they could take a hike and they'd get somebody else. So the scheme worked relatively well. Most of the drivers who needed the work went along with it. And for the most part, they still had their union benefits, health and welfare, participation in a pension fund or something. It's just that what they lost was any meaningful representation from a union representative. And their wages were effectively frozen at the amount that they were getting at the time. But they were still working. So there weren't a whole lot of people complaining, because if they complained, Bobby would, if he didn't physically, but he was physically intimidating. But I don't recall anybody testifying that he punched them in the nose or something. He would just fire them and they'd be out of there. And then when the system got going, then if it's the transportation manager of the given company, he would step back in and start managing them. That was that scheme, and it was pretty effective. And so we had a lot of tapes about it. And it came to trial pretty quickly. The District of Delaware doesn't have a lot of criminal cases. They certainly don't have a lot of organized crime cases. So Hoffa and his co-defendants were tried first. They had indicted Rispo. I was kind of objected to that, but, that was reality. Rispo was indicted. He made a deal with them, pled guilty to one count of racketeering, and he went into the witness security program. I'd like to say that he was a very successful witness security witness in that he died in his own bed, and that bed wasn't in a jail cell. But at the time, he was a very, very effective witness, Robert Rispo. And I had to work on him for a while, but he was very aggravated with Eugene Hoffa. And I remember he told me a story that after they fired him and after they thought he was going to cooperate, they had Robert Hoffa, who was one of Hoffa's sons, contact Robert Rispo and say to him that Bobby should take the heat for everybody, because in Hoffa's case, he was a father and had 5 children. And I remember Bobby Rispo told me, he said to him, "What do you think I'm raising, ponies?" So it was he was very much on board, and he was very much a key witness in this case. So between him explaining the scheme essentially from management side, and Charlie Allen letting the tapes be played from Sheeran and Sheeran's own voice.
So those were used again in this?
Right, they were used again. There's no case law that prevents the tapes from being used again, because this specific crime was not charged in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. So we used them again, and the case went in well. Labor Department did a good job on it, got to cooperate, and testified. These were people who were in on the scheme, but are out in California, basically operating franchises of Eugene Hoffa's business. So Hoffa and all his co-defendants were convicted, and then Sheeran was tried individually. Hoffa wanted him severed from the case, and he was severed. So he was tried after those guys, those defendants, and had that trial. Again, you had Bobby Rispo, Charlie Allen, a number of fact witnesses that the Labor Department had identified and brought in. And then you had a lot of documents that these 2 agents, being former IRS agents, they were very good Internal Revenue Service agents in going through records and putting together spreadsheets of how the scheme worked. And they testified. I remember, I think Mel Goodconnect was the witness on that. And he laid out how the money was paid and that sort of thing. So there wasn't any doubt about it. And the checks were mailed, back and forth to Hoffa, so that gave you a mail fraud. Well, in the second trial, in Sheeran's trial, Sheeran testifies again. Now, this time he was represented by a lawyer from Morristown, New Jersey, by the name of Glenn Zeitz.
He wasn't able to get Fitzpatrick again?
And I'll tell you why. So Fitzpatrick had quoted some price to him, like $20,000, with $10,000 up front and another $10,000 on the back end for a 4-week trial. Well, when the trial only lasted 2 weeks, Sheeran didn't pay him the other $10,000. So Fitzpatrick wouldn't represent him anymore. So Sheeran went to Zeitz. Now, I don't know if Fitzpatrick would have done as well in Delaware. I mean, you really get you get better jurors there, at least in my opinion. I think you get better jurors in New Jersey also, at least in my opinion.
And what do you mean by better? I think
better means that they don't live in South Philadelphia. They don't live anywhere in Philadelphia for that matter, maybe except in the Northeast.
So they're not sympathetic.
Have that tolerance of criminality or corruption that I think a lot of people in Philadelphia develop. And they're not going to be union people either. You know, this isn't a state with a lot of union influence, Delaware that is. And that's an issue. You know, part of the defense is always that the government is trying to break the union, you know, like it's John L. Lewis in a coal mine and during World War II or something. Anyway, so good jury. Again, they were sequestered. No, they weren't sequestered. They were not sequestered. That was another interesting thing. I was a little concerned about that, but the prior jury had not been sequestered either. So neither of the Delaware juries were sequestered. And we had a real no-nonsense judge. I just remember his last name was Latcham, and he was the chief judge. I only think they had 3 district court judges in Delaware at the time. He ran everything on time. He didn't allow any sort of delay, any sort of waste of time by the defense attorney. In this case, Zeitz, in the prior case, other attorneys. And these guys had some Philadelphia attorneys trying to think. Tom Bergstrom, I think, was an attorney and for them, and Joel Slomsky, maybe, the prior case. The case went to trial, put in the evidence. So now, Sheeran, emboldened by his successful testimony at the prior case, gets up to testify again. Well, Ron Cole was ready for him. And so in this case, the Honorable Chief Judge Latcham didn't require that the tapes be played every time they looked at the transcripts. So the tapes have been played. The jury had the transcripts. Sheeran's on the stand. He has a book of transcripts in front of him. Cole has his transcripts from Ronald Cole. And so he goes through just about every conversation and asks Sheeran, did he say that? Well, I don't, one of these blah, 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 I don't remember sort of thing. He comes off like a real jerk. And I mean, I'll tell you, I told Ron Cole after that cross-examination, I said, you cut his heart out like an Aztec priest. I mean, he was done. He had to say one tape for the end, and he said to me, we'll play this tape. And he played the tape. And anyway, Charlie Allen, who was, as I say, trying to understand how Sheeran would do something that would hurt union members, and the union says to Sheeran, won't this hurt your union? I mean, right at the end. And Sheeran says, oh, the hell with my union.
Wow.
It was just devastating.
And that was all recorded on tape.
It was all recorded on tape and actually had been played in the other case, but wasn't as germane to those charges as that were to these charges. So the jury deliberates a while. I think they did sequester him for the deliberation. But like a day later, it started, if it went to the jury on the afternoon of, say, Thursday, Friday afternoon, they come in and convict him of everything. So that was a great relief. Now, we still had another case hanging out there with the state of Delaware, a local prosecution, for the solicitation of Charlie Allen to blow up High-Ebb Cranes and Loaders, a Delaware company in Delaware.
And just for the listeners, because, people will be, well, why is that a local state trial and this other one was a federal? Could you explain that?
Okay, labor laws are federal laws, and they also involve criminal activity in multiple states, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. And so that's why that's a federal case, but principally because he was charged in U.S. District Court with a federal crime, racketeer, influence, corrupt organizations. The acronym is RICO. He was charged with Labor Management Relations Act, which is union embezzlement, which is a federal crime. He was charged with mail fraud, which is always federal. So those cases were federal. The solicitation to blow up the crane company and beat this guy up were local charges because they never happened. Had Allen blown up the crane company, had Allen blown that up, then that would have been a federal charge because that's a statute, use of an explosive device. Allen would have obviously traveled to Delaware from New Jersey where he lived to do the crime, but that's not what occurred, so you couldn't charge it. The interesting thing about that particular case is in the movie The Irishman, that is one of the crimes they actually have in the movie. they show this business being blown up with cranes. And I'm assuming they're referring to high-up cranes and loaders. And then the other thing they have is Sheeran wistfully looking at his Lincoln Continental in a car wash because he was convicted of that freebie car as a union or a labor bribe. The only relevant stuff to these cases in the last 30 minutes. Before that, it's all fantasy about the Jimmy Hoffa principle.
I have to,
in my opinion.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that, but I have to ask you this question because you talked about how the two cases were severed, and there was the Boffa case and conviction before the second trial of Sheeran went through. And there's an article. I had to ask you about this, but there's an article in the Inquirer again back in 1981 that talks about a phone call that you made to Sheeran right after the conviction of Boffa and the trial that was severed, just before you began the trial of Sheeran. Was that true?
Yeah, I told him that he was next.
Yeah, so you actually called him and got him on the phone and kind of, let him know, we had a success in this last trial and you're next. And it sounds like some people thought that was a good idea, and some people inside and outside the FBI thought it was not a good thing. What was your thoughts on that?
Well, I was just wanted, he's such a total criminal. He really deserved to have his balls broken at all times. And I'll tell you another one I did that was even better than that phone call. And it was kind of sub rosa, so people don't know about it. Glenn Zeitz complained about it in a court hearing for Ralph Natale, where I had charged Natale indicted for dealing in methamphetamine. I also worked on the murder of John McCullough, which occurred in December of 1980.
And who was John McCullough?
John McCullough was the head of the Roofers Union. So he was killed by the LCN because McCullough was trying to muscle in on the union, the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union in Atlantic City. He wanted to have the bartenders only, people who actually make the drinks, part of the Roofers Union. And he thought that would be a great way for him to extort people. So he was shot in the head by a guy named Willard Moran in, December 1980, I want to say in the middle of the month. Moran posed as a flower delivery guy bringing poinsettias to McCullough's house. By the summer of 1981, we were in the process of arresting on behalf of the Philadelphia Police Department and the district attorney in Philadelphia, a guy named Albert Didone and Raymond Long John Mortorano, who were the two guys responsible for the crime. So the surveillance squad was on Didone, and I find out from them that we now have the warrants, and that Didone is drinking with Frank Sheeran in the Holiday Inn on Route 70 in Cherry Hill. It was a place called the Cherry Pit Lounge. It was right next to the Latin Casino. Latin Casino was still there at the time, and the racetrack had burned down and hadn't been rebuilt yet. It would have been across the street. So I go in there with John Main, who was the homicide detective. You might have remembered him. He was around the office for years. And he was the homicide detective assigned to Squad 1. And we go in there, and we arrest Al Didone. And on the way out, I said to Sheeran, "Hey, Frank, thanks for the tip. Otherwise, we would have been looking for Al all day." And we leave.
Wow.
So the other dirtballs around the bar, now they're Sheeran. So, I just did it, kind of on a whim. 3 weeks later, I had a hearing in U.S. District Court in Camden charging Ralph Natale with methamphetamine distribution. This was a leftover case from Charlie Allen. And Glenn Zeitz was representing Natale. He complains to Judge Brotman about my behavior at the Holiday Inn. And I'm thinking, Judge Brotman doesn't care. But he wanted to do something about it because I guess Sheeran called him and he was really crazed about it.
So really, Sheeran doesn't care that your behavior was bad. He just wanted to make it clear to everybody out there that you were, busting his balls, that he really didn't give you a tip.
No, he didn't give me a tip.
Yeah.
He never cooperated. I think that a couple of agents, they show in the movie a couple of agents talking to him at this retirement community. And I'm not sure who that was. It might have been Charlie Murray, because I know Charlie Murray worked on Sheeran after he got out of prison. But anyway, Sheeran ultimately gets convicted, and that's that. After the federal conviction, there was a trial in Superior Court in Delaware where he was convicted of solicitation of the arson and the assault. So he got convicted of that also. The state assistant attorney general was a gentleman by the name of Dwayne Werb. Anyway, he did a great job on that case, and we convicted Sheeran, and Sheeran got like 9 years. He ultimately lost his appeals, and now he was going to have to go to prison. So my final shot at him, I went to the Bureau of Prisons in the Customs House. Their regional office was there, and I say, I got this guy. If possible, I don't want him to go into a prison here in the area, like Ferriton or Lewisburg. Is it possible to get him shipped out of town so he doesn't get a lot of people dropping by to tell him what a great guy he is? So the assignment officer said, well, I'm just going to do it on your say-so. You'll have to send us a letter on letterhead. And I said, no problem. What should I say? And they told me. So I went back to the office, go back, write the letter, signed by the supervisor, carry it back over to the guy, give it to him in an envelope. They assigned Sheeran, and of course you see this in the film, The Irishman, to Sandstone, which is up in northern Minnesota. It's outside Duluth. And that was perfect.
That was like your last shot, your party shot.
So that's off where he went. Now, in the movie, they make it look like Russell Buffalino's in the prison with him. I don't think that was the case. I think Buffalino was in Danbury. Most of the time, Buffalino was sick, so he was either in Butner or Springfield, the prison hospitals. But, so off to Sandstone he went, and that's where he sat for about 8 years. And then when his sentence was up, I followed it real carefully. When he was going to come up for parole, he probably behaved himself in prison. That's kind of their assessment. And this was under the old system where you got parole about halfway through your sentence. You could even get less than that, like a third. You were eligible after a third, but Sheeran was going to spend more time than that. I found out about it because the parole board, they were at the customs house also. So I kind of tracked it. And I made sure Delaware knew where he was, and they had a detainer on him. And so when he got out of Sandstone, they went out there and got him and brought him right back to Delaware to start serving his sentence there. And I think he got 7 years now. I think I said 9 earlier, but I think it was 7. So he went to a prison down, and he didn't go to Smyrna because he wasn't, somebody that they would have trouble controlling. He didn't need to be behind a high wall. So they took him to their medium security facility, which is on U.S. Route 13 in Georgetown. And I used to occasionally drive back and forth on 13 for for family reasons and stuff, or coming down to Tidewater and the Norfolk area. And, I'd look over there at that prison and think, son of a gun's still there. But he probably did 4 years there. So then he gets out. So by this time, he's done 13 years in prison, approximately. So he goes back to Springfield. I think he lived in Springfield, Delaware County. That's where we arrested him, and I think he ended up back there. Didn't take him long for him to bump into another one of my sources. By this time, I was over in the South Jersey RA, but I still worked this guy. And Sheeran wanted to get back basically in the good graces of the La Cosa Nostra because he never testified. He just did his time and kept his mouth shut. He wanted to go meet the present leadership, and I'm not sure who it was at the time. It may have been John Stanfa. I don't think it was Uncle Joe Legambi yet, but it could have been Stanfa. So he asked the informant to drive him down there. That's a godsend to us because we had fixed surveillance on these places. And there he goes. Surveillance squad follows Sheeran in, and they let him go back and forth a couple of times. He makes a couple of stops there, and they get pictures of him out on the street talking with whoever the LCN boss was then. Next thing you know, got a package for the parole board, and bingo bango, Sheeran's picked up by the marshals, right back to prison. So he did basically, when he was in Delaware's custody, he was still on parole federally. So that time is clicking along. He had 18 years to do. So basically, he only had about another year to do, but we put him back in prison for another year. And so he went to his mandatory release date, which is pretty unusual. So after it was all said and done, he did about 14 years. of time behind the wall. He didn't, he was barred from being a union official, working for the union, having anything to do with the union. So
yeah, I was just going to ask you that.
It was basically done. So that's Sheeran.
Well, that definitely gives us a much larger understanding of who Frank Sheeran was outside of the movie. So now let's talk about the movie. I had to watch it in 2 parts because it is over 3 hours long, but it is so convincing. It's not that you're not saying that Frank Sheeran wasn't capable of being involved and directing people to commit murders, but it sounds like your thoughts are that he didn't actually commit them himself. He wasn't a hitman.
No, he wasn't.
So why would he say?
I base that on the fact that every murder or attempted murder, and the Big Bobby Marino one is the best example. If Sheeran was so bold as he was going to go into Umberto's clam house in Little Italy in Manhattan and shoot Joey Gallo, walk in there and shoot him when there are all these people around and get away, are you telling me he couldn't drive up to the 200 block of Market Street in Philadelphia in the middle of the day, and that's when this murder occurred, and go in there and shoot this guy? Sure he could. One in the afternoon, 2 in the afternoon when it occurred. And so that's a perfect reason. I mean, that's the first thing. And every other murder that he solicited them. He wasn't saying, oh, I'll do it myself. I'll shoot the guy at local 500. No, he didn't say that. He wanted Charlie Allen to do it. I'll shoot the guy who is head of the newspaper delivers union up in New York. No, he wanted Charlie Allen to do it. And those would have been murders that, if he was so bold that he did the Joey Gallo murder, for example, or Jimmy Hoffa, those would have been easy for him, because those were people who were easily isolated, nothing to worry about.
And who trusted him.
Would have had their guard down.
Yeah, they trusted him.
They trusted him. I mean, Big Bobby Marino knew Sheeran. He wouldn't have necessarily feared him. He would have probably figured that Sheeran was coming to try to talk him out of doing whatever he was going to do. He wouldn't have anticipated him being shot. So that's one thing. I mean, he never struck me. He struck me as somebody who always used somebody else to do the violent deeds he wanted done.
So
I can't think of any occasion where we had him at union meetings or meetings involving management officials in the union where he did anything violent, did any sort of physical intimidation, even yelled at people he didn't do. So,
So why, as an old man and sitting in a nursing home, is he telling Charles Brandt, the author of I Heard You Paint Houses, why did he tell him that he did all of these murders? I can see him maybe trying to convince him that he killed Hoffa, but to add in all of these other murders, I think he said 25, what do you think that's about?
Well, I think that's, he's just a sociopath in the sense, and I'm sure, many of these guys are sociopaths, and Sheeran was a sociopath. He had no conscience. He could say whatever he wants to say. Brandt has a good story. Brandt actually represented him on appeal in the Delaware state case. So that's how he first met Sheeran. I think he might have been assigned to do it. I'm not sure. But anyway, that's how he first met Sheeran. And he could say whatever he wants. I remember in the book, I think, and I haven't read the whole book because it's just BS, but they said that I was walking in front of the courthouse, I don't know which one day, and 2 of his little minions jumped out of the bushes and threw a blanket over my head. Well, that's like Bowery Boys BS. That's nothing. That's the sort of thing, just like the phrase, I hear you paint houses. It's not something that's in the mob vernacular. And I think it's all just cooked up in Sheeran's head. He wasn't a good liar. He could lie sometimes and get away with it like he did in the first federal trial. But he certainly didn't get away with it in the second federal trial. Brandt accepted it at face value, I assume, because it's a good story. And then Martin Scorsese, who directs the movie The Irishman, I found the movie he did called Goodfellas from back in 1990 or 1991, which was about Jimmy Burke, who was the Irish gangster out there in around the airport in Queens, and a bad guy, and Henry Hill, who was the protagonist there who tells the story and everything and is still alive, was in the witness security program. That was a good movie. That was an entertaining movie. But was it accurate? No, wasn't accurate. I mean, some of it was accurate. Some of the people being killed because of the Lufthansa heist and that sort of things. But other things were totally made up. In this case with Sheeran, sure, there are things that happened. Jimmy Hoffa definitely disappeared. Sheeran was definitely out in Detroit, the Detroit area that weekend. Sheeran definitely had a relationship with Buffalino. But did he kill Joey Gallo? Because Joey Gallo had Joe Colombo killed? Why would they go outside of the five-family mafia setup in New York and hire somebody like Sheeran, a 6'5", 260-pound oaf, essentially, to do this and not think anybody would remember him? I mean, it's just baloney. I mean, that Gallo murder is totally baloney. It was just never would have happened. And I think the Hoffa thing, did Sheeran lull Hoffa? I mean, it's possible, but he didn't shoot him.
Interesting.
That's my part. You can edit that down.
No, I'm not going to edit any of it. It's fantastic. I mean, and that was the whole purpose of this episode, is just to get people a real understanding of who Frank Sheeran was. Because when you watch the movie, you almost forget until it comes to the point where he is accepting the award at the, I guess it was the Latin Casino.
Yes.
Yeah. Until you get to that part, you almost forget that he was a union official. You almost feel like he was just a hitman. And so I really wanted to reach out to you and get a real good understanding of who this guy was as it related to the union and what, known law enforcement, what law enforcement really knows about him and what he did. So I really appreciate that. But I can't let you go until you talk a little bit about your own FBI career, because not only your father, but am I right, and your uncle were also assistant directors under former director J. Edgar Hoover?
Well, that's right. My father was an assistant director. He joined the FBI in 1934. In 34, they were organized differently, and he was a laboratory examiner. He had a degree in geology, and so he did soils analysis and stuff like that. But he was a special agent, and so he in effect was like a evidence recovery team of one. He was assigned. My father was assigned to the flying squad, then the squad that flew out from headquarters to big cases like the Weyerhaeuser kidnapping and the Bremer kidnapping, cases like that from the 30s. And so my father worked in the laboratory, but never was in a field division. I mean, that's the irony of his career, is he really never left Washington. He's originally from Butte, Montana, but came east to go to University of Virginia and went back to Montana, worked in the mines as a mining engineer for a year, didn't like that. So he came back and got a job with the FBI. And he had the entree because his older brother, Edward Allen Tamm, was already an FBI agent. And because back in those days, there were only like 300 FBI agents.
And your father's name? We haven't mentioned his name.
Well, his name is Quinn. I'm Quinn Jr. He's Quinn Sr. But I always used my middle name, John. So my uncle's name, Edward. So Edward is also an agent, was a graduate of Georgetown Law School, went in the FBI in 1930. He's 5 years older than my father. And and this is when you could go to law school without having finished undergraduate school. So but he had a regular law degree from Georgetown, went to work for the FBI, and Hoover took a liking to him. And 5 years in, he was SAC in Pittsburgh. But you'd be talking about Pittsburgh covering, the western half of Pennsylvania and all of West Virginia. You probably only had 20 agents.
Very, very early days.
Right. So then he came back to headquarters, my uncle, and he was the assistant director and then the executive assistant director today. But back then it was called assistant to the director. And he was in charge of all the intelligence operations. So counterintelligence principally. During World War II, he was the assistant director of the intelligence division, which today is the counterintelligence division. So I have an old photo of him and J. Edgar Hoover sitting in the 5th floor classroom at the Department of Justice with their backs to the camera when they were trying the Nazi saboteurs. The generals are sitting at the table in the front, and the saboteurs, the 8 Germans, are down the side. And my uncle, Jagger Hoover, and I think Jackson was the attorney general at the time. They were sitting on the right side of the courtroom. So when I was a new agent, you were always sworn in that room. That was the old classroom for new agents class before they set up the academy. The pattern in the old days was that you first went to headquarters, everybody stayed at the Harrington Hotel, and they went to class in both the Washington Field Office, which is now the Trump International Hotel. That building was the old post office building, and at headquarters when it was in the Department of Justice. So I was sworn in that room in January 75, but then we all went down and got on the bus and went to Quantico. But I did think that was interesting. So ironically, fast forward 20 years or something, I have had some reason to go over to the Department of Justice. No, fast forward farther than that, like 28 years. And I made a point of going up and seeing that room. And by then, the Department of Justice had put cubicles in there. It was no longer a classroom. But it still had a plaque on the wall that said that's where they tried the Nazi saboteurs in the court-martial. So anyway, my uncle left the FBI in 1948, became a U.S. District Court judge in the District of Columbia, and then he ultimately went on to the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia. And my father retired in 1961 and became the executive director of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. But my career, I wouldn't have done it any other way. I really enjoyed working on the street. And so I became an agent in January of 75.
Was that something that you knew that you were going to do, all the time?
Not necessarily, no. When I graduated, I went to George Washington University in D.C., and I was in an officer program in the U.S. Naval Reserve. So when I graduated from GW, I had already gone to OCS, Officer Candidate School in Newport, and I was commissioned an ensign in the Navy. And so I was a naval officer on active duty for about 3 years and 6 months before I went in the FBI. And then I went in the FBI in January of 75. And I, at the time, was considering the Navy as a career. But I get seasick, and my wife didn't like the fact that I was away from home for like 6 months. So I applied to the FBI, and I probably had built-in advantages. I'd be the first one to admit that probably my application was expedited. After going through Quantico, and back then I think it was 15 weeks, was assigned to Philadelphia. Was fine with me. So went to Philadelphia and was there from April of 75 until November of 98. And I really liked the South Jersey RA. It was my best assignment.
Well, I got there after you left because I was actually in the South Jersey RA for almost 4 years, from like 2001 to 2004.
Then I went to the Atlantic City RA in Newark for 14 months. And it was not an assignment I cared for, didn't get along with the supervisor at all. And I had basically gotten along with and had good supervisors all the way through my career, good SACs, even good ASACs. Sometimes you can run into a bad ASAC. There are a lot more of them. Anyway.
Did you make that transfer or request that transfer just to get to the shore? Because I know.
Yes, I did, because my wife had been transferred by the state of New Jersey, who she worked for, to the shore. And we owned a house down there in Ocean City. So it was an easy transfer. When I was in Atlantic City, I was contacted by Rich Macco, and he was on this special case up in Boston where they're investigating John Conley specifically, who was a retired agent, and a number of other people in the Boston division, criminally, not an OPR case, for being in cahoots with James J. Whitey Bulger, the infamous Irish gangster, who's been depicted in several movies. Jack Nicholson played him in one called The Departed. I jumped at the chance to go up there. My son at the time was going to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, so it worked out well. I really didn't miss any of his baseball games or anything like that. And I was leaving Atlantic City on an uptick because I had put together a case that allowed us to arrest a heroin dealer. That dealer had more heroin than they'd ever seen in Atlantic City, so that worked out, and I kind of turned that case over to another agent and left. And so I worked that job for 3 years. It was very rewarding.
So did you retire out of Boston?
I retired off the 9/11 Commission. In April of 2003, when the 9/11 Commission started, I had applied to them and told them about my Boston background and the fact that I had already been doing kind of management assessment investigations, because we also did that as part of our investigation in Boston to see who screwed up or how things could be fixed so this wouldn't happen again with informants. And I got picked up to work there.
What did you do after you retired?
I was off for a week, and then I went to work for a defense contractor by the name of Booz Allen down here, Tidewater, Virginia, the Norfolk, Virginia area. I now work for the Presbyterian Church in their regional authority, and I'm the minister's personnel officer.
Well, that's interesting. That sounds like a big switch.
Yes, you don't cuss here, that's for sure.
I like to give my guests the last word. So what would you like to say?
One of the things I want to say is that I was fortunate to work in the Philadelphia division all those years. It was a great place to work. I have somewhat of a prickly personality. I guess you pointed that out a few times, but most people gave me grace. I have spoken about other cases like on the Discovery Channel, and one of the points I like to make is that many of my informants were very good, very committed. Whatever motivated them, they did a very good job and allowed a lot of bad people to be locked up, like Frank Sheeran. So I credit the informants for doing a good job also, and I'm glad I was able to find them and work with them. I don't like to have the informants forgotten because they're such an important part of law enforcement, especially federal law enforcement, and the work of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of John Tamm, as well as a photo of Frank Sheeran, newspaper articles about John Tamm's investigation and various prosecutions of Frank Sheeran, in addition to news articles and a video trailer of the movie The Irishman, all about Frank Sheeran's life and the disappearance of Teamster leader Jimmy Hoffa. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. This podcast is about true crime. But if you're also interested in crime fiction, I want to invite you to join my reader team, where once a month, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI, books written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. Nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You can join on my website or use the link in the description of this episode in your podcast app. I would love it if you also check out my books. My nonfiction, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And there's also my Philadelphia FBI Corruption Squad crime series. All of my books are available wherever books are sold. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.